So welcome everyone to CIH's podcast on decarbonisation and zero carbon agenda. And our homes have never been more important to us than they have been during the coronavirus crisis. For some people, home has been a sanctuary, but for others, it has been more of a challenge. We believe that everyone deserves a safe, secure, comfortable place to call home, not just now in the middle of the crisis, but always. That's why we've launched Homes at the Heart, a national campaign and coalition calling for once-in-a-generation investment in social housing. Our 6-week campaign of action will showcase why homes should be at the heart of our recovery, covering a range of themes that highlight all of the ways that social housing is good for the economy and society, from creating jobs and delivering care and support to decarbonising the country and supporting prosperous communities. The theme for this week is a greener country, and as part of a range of activities across media channels, I'm very excited to be hosting a special CIH podcast focusing on the decarbonisation agenda. I'm really lucky to be joined today by Lulu Shooter, Head of Policy and Public Affairs for the Federation of Master Builders, John Kiely, Director of Housing and Public Sector at Savills, and Jonathan Higgs, Chief Executive of Raven Housing Trust. First up, I just wanted to start with a rather staggering fact, which is that residential housing is responsible for 22% of all UK emissions. Social housing contributes around 10% of this. So decarbonising housing is therefore critical to achieving the government's ambition of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And with that in mind, I'd like to open up by asking our panel what they think are the significant challenges we need to overcome if we're going to be able to retrofit at scale and meet that 2050 target. So John, I wondered if we could just start with you, please.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everybody. I think from a Savills perspective, there's a huge number of challenges in the sector at the moment, and I think the zero carbon agenda is clearly probably the largest price tag amongst everything, but is the agenda that's got the longest period to get this right. And one of the key things that we need to make sure is that we have no early regrets, that what we do to start with is what we're going to continue to doing. And there's too many examples in the past of people trying things and finding out that they don't work. So really, from our point of view, the key thing I think is that social landlords actually understand their stock, understand the wider asset management agenda, and make the right decisions based upon the right information and for the right reasons. The challenges that the sector faces at the moment, building safety has been first and foremost in everybody's minds for the last couple of years, and in our view and our experience of the work that we've done with the NatFed and the LGA, that will very much remain at the top of the agenda for the next couple of years. After that, we've got a challenge of a potential Decent Homes 2. We've got the challenge of building the new houses that the country so clearly needs. And zero carbon sits amongst all of this as a bit of a 30-year challenge, although accepting in some parts of the country, it's a much shorter timetable with people declaring climate emergencies and looking for a target of 2030, 2038 or whatever. But I think the real key here for a social landlord is to make sure that it invests in the right property at the right time and takes the time to make informed decisions. And I think a real challenge is making sure that we have the right data to help us make those decisions, that we have the right strategic debates before we worry about whether we're putting in heat pumps or whether we're doing one particular type of work. We have to address this from a much higher strategic level and ensuring that we're going down the right track to start with. So I think we need to look at this in the round and take the next couple of years developing the way forward, and then embarking upon a plan of zero carbon from maybe 2024, something like that onwards, where we have the time. If we don't have the time because we have declared an earlier climate target, then we need to look at it slightly differently. But generally across the sector, I think the real issue here is making sure that we spend the right money, because we don't have enough money to do all of this work. So we spend the right money at the right properties at the right time and take on board the residents in this as well, because there's going to be massively disruptive work, and we need to make sure that we address the residents' issues. And we do this in a controlled and measured way. So I think, keeping it at a high level. James, that's my initial views to start with.
John, thank you. So Jonathan, if I could just turn to you then as a chief executive of a housing association, and what do you think about the summary that John has given us there, and what does it mean for you and for Raven?
Yeah, great. Thanks, James. Yeah, firstly, a little bit about Raven Housing Trust. We're about 6,000 homes based in Surrey and East Sussex, down in the southeast. And an LSVT, so a lot of our homes are 1950s-ish, but like a lot of LSVTs, we've built a lot of new stock. So crudely, about 5,000 homes are pretty old and about 1,000 homes are relatively modern. So we've got a range of different stock. The challenges that I see ahead for us, I think John referred to government policy. I think it's key, clearly, and it is beginning to emerge what that might look like with various pilots announced. I think it's got to be key for the government and the sector to develop a working relationship built on trust, if that's not a bit trite. But this is a long-term, this is a marathon and not a sprint. It's a long-term project that both parties have got to have confidence the other side is going to see this through and deliver. So I think working with government hand in hand is key, and it's not just about money, it's about a range of different things. I think there's an initial target that we've all got around EPCC by 2030, 2035, and that's a bit of a nonsense, to be honest. In a lot of our stock, there's a real risk that we might be undertaking work to deliver against that target in a way that is inconsistent with delivering a net zero carbon output for that particular property. So there are some government targets that exist at the moment that may well prove to be unhelpful in delivering the longer term goal of net zero carbon across all residential homes in this country. I think another challenge for us in this relationship with government is around the trade-offs that we're inevitably going to have to make. John referred to the big price tag attached to delivering net zero carbon. For Raven, we've publicised our costs likely to be in the order of about £20,000 per home. That currently, most of that is not sitting in our business plan. I mean, that is a massive hit for us, and many other landlords will be in the same boat. If we have to fund this ourselves, there are a lot of other things that we're not going to be able to do, and there are currently expectations of government that the sector will deliver many of those other things, not least, of course, new homes to help solve the housing crisis. And there needs to be a grown-up, mature debate about the trade-offs that will exist. You can't spend the same pound twice, so are you going to put it into the net zero carbon agenda or into the new homes agenda? And there needs to be a conversation about those trade-offs. And of course, for the housing association sector, there are other big ticket items as well, particularly around decent homes too, and health and safety improvements off the back of the bill that's recently come out and the lessons from Grenfell. I think another challenge for us, which John has already mentioned, is about working with our tenants. This is a broader kind of message about cultural shift, I think, in the nation as a whole, not just amongst social housing tenants, about how we attribute value to improving the carbon performance of our homes, and what we are excuse me, what we're prepared to pay for that improvement. We're very used to putting £1 in and getting £1.10 back, or we don't put that pound in the first place. But there is a wider message to be put out there to convince people of the greater good of this investment and the benefits that will flow from it, I think. So that alongside the obvious practicalities of working with tenants while we're making improvements to their homes. The one thing that I would say is we did a piece of work with our residents towards the end of last year called the Voice of the Customer. And the thing that we heard loud and clear from our residents is the challenges they face around affordability. And that's not just about rent levels, it's about the cost of living in a home, as well as the challenges of getting into employment and the pitfalls of welfare. And we see that the zero carbon agenda is an integral part of helping address that affordability challenge for our residents. So when the issue comes up about residents contributing towards the cost of energy improvements in their homes, we're taking a slightly different view of this. We think that really this is a key, making those improvements is a key part of improving the affordability of the home for our residents. I think that'll probably do as a kickoff. I'm sure there's lots more to explore later on, James. Yeah,
sure. Thank you, Jonathan. That's incredibly helpful. Lulu, can I come to you now and perhaps a little bit for listeners about the wider remit of your organisation and your interest in this specific area, thinking a little bit wider than purely the social housing sector.
Sure, thanks, James. So my name's Lulu Shooter. I'm the Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Federation of Master Builders. The FMB is the largest trade association in the construction industry. We represent around 7,500 small to medium-sized construction firms across the UK. The majority of those firms operate in the repair and maintenance sector, so your typical local builder who will build extensions, do loft conversions and things like that. Around half of our members build new homes, and a smaller proportion also are kind of involved in local authority contracts and some commercial and industrial work too. So kind of quite a core value of the FMBs is to raise quality and standards in the built environment. So not anyone can be a master builder. We conduct independent inspections for all firms on joining, and that's kind of a really key part of what we do. We've been really interested in supporting the retrofit sector to grow for a number of years. You know, we've been talking about this in terms of decarbonisation and more recently the net zero target. But since, you know, the impact of the coronavirus on the economy and the impact of that on local building firms, for which it was quite a significant impact, we've been thinking more about how this fits into the recovery agenda and the Build Back Better agenda. So we've been working collaboratively with a number of different organisations across the sector, working to kind of build consensus around how we can support that recovery and make sure that we're retaining jobs, creating new jobs, but also, you know, speaking to the wide variety of policy priorities like levelling up, high street regeneration and decarbonisation. And it's become really clear that investing in retrofit, you know, ticks all those boxes really. And so we're really keen to understand, and this echoes both John and Jonathan's points, of how we can kind of build a joint strategy between government and industry to take a long-term view of retrofit and to kind of achieve these targets. So most recently, the Green Homes grants were announced, which you know, we may come on to talk about later, but that's policy for homes in England where people can apply for a voucher to cover 2/3 of the cost of certain energy efficiency installations, and that's for a period of 6 months. And we're really keen to see that as a kind of launch pad for a longer term strategy, which, you know, can be more ambitious, can bring forward more funding, but crucially will help to develop a kind of self-sustaining market, one that isn't reliant on grant funding, one that helps bring forward kind of, you know, new models of private finance like green mortgages and things like that, to support the market. And, you know, through that, I think there is some important work to do in the communications piece in terms of improving awareness of what retrofit is in the private owner-occupier market. So kind of build it up as an aspirational home improvement project that sits alongside something like a new kitchen, or indeed can be implemented as part of wider home improvement projects. So I think for us, there's kind of a few key issues and challenges to work on there in terms of building that long-term policy landscape, in terms of growing the demand among consumers, but also, as I think you said, you know, James, like growing the supply chain and mobilising the supply chain too.
Lulu, thanks very much, and I'm going to throw this next question out to I suppose any of us that choose to answer it really, or that have a view on it. So is it clear at this point what government strategy is in this space, and do we need to see more from government by way of policy announcements, thinking ahead to spending review, for example? So yeah, to summarise that, do we know enough as far as the government strategy is concerned to be able to get on and do? John, hopefully this isn't too much of a hospital pass. Can I send this one your way for an initial?
Sure. Yeah. I think probably the answer is no, we don't. There isn't clarity on this. As far as we can see, we're kind of sandwiched in the social sector. We're sandwiched between a number of different government departments. We've got BEIS, who's responsible for this. We've got the Treasury responsible for finance. We have the housing regulator that we have to deal with, MHCLG. So there's lots of different government departments who are involved in this. From a longer term perspective, I think all social landlords would like to have a little bit more clarity. All we have really is a zero carbon by 2050 sort of target. But how are we going to get there? And I think if you think about the social housing market, where we have kind of joined up approach to massive improvement works that we've done in the past, and then transfer that, as Lulu was talking about, into the private sector, how's the private sector going to get there? I think that's a completely different ballgame. From a social housing sector, I think we need some clearer strategy as to what the expectations are, how this could all be funded, and really making sure that between all the different departments we have one clear direction. And I don't think we really have that at the moment. And Jonathan, you know, you sit on the client side of this. I don't know whether your thoughts are different, other than we have a target. That's it.
Yeah, it's interesting at the moment. The regulator has asked housing associations to submit their business plans by the end of this month, incorporating all costs associated with new health and safety requirements and energy efficiency improvements to their homes. Now, strictly speaking, that should include all the costs associated with delivering against what is an obligation to deliver net zero carbon by 2050. In the absence, really, of a government framework for how that is going to be supported, I think that most housing associations will look fundamentally different. And that's not just a function of whether they're big associations or small associations. Every association will look very different if they've got to find the money to fund this on their own in its entirety, because it is such a big bill. It'll have to be part of a broader strategic discussion for every housing association as it makes those trade-offs that I spoke about earlier. But also what we're desperate for is to understand the extent of that government support, because that will inform the trade-offs. And at the moment, there are some kind of historic funding packages, some changing funding packages, but a lack of clarity about the long-term commitment, the overall long-term commitment, but also how it will be rolled out, because it is, to be fair, quite early stages, and government is looking at some pilots now, and I know John Savills have been involved in some of those conversations with government about the nature of those pilots. But I think we've seen a lot of pilots across the sector already. People have a rough idea about what works, what doesn't work. I think the big challenge will be twofold. Picking up kind of what Lulu's members will be concerned with. It's about building scale. It's about having confidence in the long-term market that allows providers, constructors and designers, to innovate and drive down cost. And then it's about government and its support for the different initiatives that are out there, and the rules that will govern the extent of that support for each individual provider. And I think at the moment we kind of lack that government picture. It is emerging, but it's certainly going to take, I think, a couple of years for government to be clear on exactly how they want to participate in this. In the meantime, providers are having to make some very broad brush assumptions for the benefit of their regulators and very soon, I'm sure, their funders.
Jonathan, can I just ask quickly, because you mentioned in your comments earlier that you felt that some targets are actually unhelpful in the road to net zero, and I just wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about that, because I thought that was really interesting.
Well, there is where fuel poverty is an issue, there is a target to get all homes to EPC-C by 2030. There are some ways of delivering on that to get to clear the EPC-C hurdle by 2030, but that isn't necessarily the work that you would do to get that property to a net zero carbon standard. You might approach it differently, and you also might do it in a slightly different sequence. In an ideal world, you would want to approach a whole block of flats at the same time. But let's say the corner flat on each block performs particularly poorly, and so that is driving you to address that sooner rather than later to get those corner flats up to an EPC-C. Whereas in an ideal world, you might rather wait, do that in 5 years' time and take them all up to net zero carbon. But if you were going to do that, you might miss your EPC-C target. So it's about what is most important. It's almost like that initial target's been set on the assumption that there's a kind of linear progression from where you are now to get to net zero carbon, and it doesn't work like that. So I think sometimes government targets can be counterproductive to the long-term goal, and I think this might be an example of that. So it's just making sure we understand what flexibilities are available to providers if they want to manage their programme to deliver best value for money for their residents, even if that might mean that you slightly miss a target by a few years.
That's really interesting. I think that idea of kind of having a staged approach to this links kind of with I think how government policy could really help drive the kind of mobilisation of skills. So, you know, in the absence of having a longer term policy, having kind of staged approaches does in some ways help to, I guess, mobilise upskilling or taking on new apprentices in the industry. But we really need that longer term policy to understand where the skills gaps are, to understand, you know, what kind of skills and installation knowledge we need to be supporting tradespeople to have. So I think just in terms of the policy agenda, that would really help in terms of mobilising the supply chain. Thanks,
Lulu. John, so picking up on that, do you think there is an opportunity here, specifically, I guess, for the social sector to lead the way on some of this, almost as a kind of test bed for the wider housing market, and does that itself bring some risks and challenges too?
I think you're right, James. I think the social housing sector is able to kind of lead the market here. If you think back to the early 2000s when Decent Homes Standard came into play, there was a massive, you know, crash bang wallop approach that we need to deliver billions of pounds worth of work, and this sector managed to do that in quite a logical, progressive way, obtaining pretty good value for money across the whole, and delivered billions and billions of pounds. I mean, we were involved in sort of £8 or £9 billion ourselves, and that was only a small proportion of the market. So this sector is very good at managing programs of scale, and also looking at the right technologies for the right house, and from a resident's perspective as well. So I think we are very well placed to do this. I do think, though, it needs to be done in a joined up way and in a progressive way. I mean, one of the challenges in the past is that all social landlords, for all the right reasons, have gone and chased where the grant funding is or where the feed-in tariffs have been to do elements of work, whether it's boiler swaps, whether it's been external wall insulation, solar PV or whatever. And there's been good reasons for doing that. But we have learned some lessons from that as well. And I think we need to sort of just step back and not rush into these things and develop a proper holistic approach to this. And there's been a lot of talk about a whole house retrofit approach, which is great in one respect, but someone gets their work today, someone else has got to wait 30 years for that if we go down that road. So there's got to be a different way of doing this, and it's not one size fits all. And I think that's the key thing. Jonathan talked about the block of flats. Clearly, you really want to do a block of flats differently from you would houses. We have lots of leaseholder interests in blocks of flats. So how do we get leaseholders on board to deal with this problem? And when you look at an average cost of, say, £20,000, and Jonathan's figures are very consistent with figures that we've got, they vary between social landlords of £14,000 to £26,000, give or take. So it's a huge amount of money. How do you engage leaseholders? We're talking about residents. How do you engage with those in this? And where do they get this money from to pay for these improvements? So we really are well placed to deal with all the nuances that we've got in delivering this, but it's going to take time. And then how does that get rolled out to the private sector and private individuals and private landlords? Lulu, that's one for your guys to deal with, but that's a mega challenge because it's all about quality. There's no point doing this type of work, doing it badly. So we need to get quality standards established as well. And I can see the social sector well geared up to do that over a period of a few years. Thanks,
John. Just thinking about some of those costs. I mean, 20k a property. That's a not insignificant amount of money. And is it possible here that there will be properties in both the social sector and indeed in the private sector where it's just the sums just don't add up and doesn't make sound business sense to put that level of investment into that kind of property? And if that is the case, what are the options? So Jonathan, can I bring you in on that, please?
Yeah, James. We're wrestling with that at the moment. It's when you combine this with Decent Homes 2 and also the health and safety costs, we have, as have many associations for a number of years, had the kind of net present value approach to looking at the performance of their stock, and that stock that is in low demand and obviously a high ongoing liability. Associations have long been used to looking at that stock and considering an alternative use or disposal. These new requirements are going to really raise the bar, and a lot more properties are going to fail the test of long-term sustainability. So we're at Raven producing a new investment and disposal strategy that inevitably is going to be more aggressive than we have been in the past. We're what we consider ourselves to be a community housing association. So our intention is always to use the asset for the greatest benefit for the community. So our primary goal is to make sure we're not just going to offload poor quality stock into the private sector and leave it for someone else to solve the problem. Our likely approach, and we haven't completed this work yet, is going to be a far more regeneration work off the back of this rather than disposal of the particular property or site. So we can see ourselves demolishing and regenerating more of our estates than we have done traditionally in the past. That's quite an expensive way of delivering new homes. And it's also, of course, not entirely carbon neutral. Knocking down a property has a carbon, you're consigning the embodied carbon cost of that redundant home to the waste paper bin. So it's not entirely beneficial. But if it can provide a better quality home with improved cost in use going forward, then that's certainly what we're going to be looking to do more of.
James, if I could just chip in on that one as well, because I mean, we've been looking at a different appraisal model for regeneration works, based for the reasons that Jonathan has said there, and looking at this in a more holistic way. But the real key thing here is that a lot of social housing, the vast majority of it, has been around for the last 70 years or more. And we have a level of investment here that can't be supported by a 30-year business plan. It's going to need longer. So this housing has to have a life of at least another 50, 70, maybe 100 years. And you have to look at this housing stock that we've got today and say, is this going to be good for another 70 years' time? Are we going to want to live in these houses when they're 150 years old? And we all see lovely Victorian and Georgian terraces around, but huge tracts of Victorian properties have been demolished over the years and new buildings installed. And a lot of those weren't in great condition. We kind of kept a lot of the good ones. And we have to really take a long, hard look at the stock that we've got and say, is it fit for another 75 to 100 years, first of all? And that's a real tough question. But it's this reality is that to spend this sum of money, we have to be sure that it's worth it. And we've got the right stock, but we've got some stock that just financially doesn't stack up. And therefore, we have to take a different view on it. And so maybe the good stuff is subsidised by the less financially sound stuff. But at least we have to go through that process of understanding why we're making decisions.
Yeah. And Lulu, so Jonathan's talked to us about, and John, in fact, about the housing association side of it, since, you know, well resourced, well organised, well established associations looking to tackle this very challenging area. What are some of the do the issues that the social housing sector face, are these mirrored amongst your membership?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think there is absolutely kind of a link between implementation in these two sectors. So, you know, as we've discussed, investing in social housing, as it's an economy of scale, we can look at how we can reduce cost and share best practice, you know, when we move that into the private residential sector. And I also think we can actually use case studies of how these improvements have impacted on the lives of the tenants to kind of build the case for owner-occupiers to bring forward their own personal investment into their homes. Because the thing is with retrofit is that there are such huge numbers attached to it, whether it's the cost or the carbon saving or you know, the improvement in productivity. But sometimes we need to bring it back down to the human level of like, how is this going to change my life once I install these things? And I think sharing those experiences between people who live in all kinds of different tenures of housing would be really helpful. I also think that kind of starting to really address this within the social housing sector is beneficial from a supply chain point of view. If you can engage a kind of multitude of smaller contractors, then you're actually helping to build more capacity and spread that knowledge across the sector, moving, you know, as it moves into and grows in the private sector. Just on the whole house approach and you know, the kind of total costs that you might attach to each house that's needed to decarbonise. For me, the whole house approach is about having a plan for each house, which, you know, as we've said, is different to the next. And for that person to have an understanding of the sequence of different measures that they can do, it doesn't necessarily all have to happen in one go. And, you know, as we'll see with the Green Homes grants, that will just cover a cost of one, maybe two installations. So it's about having, I think, the plan, because then as well, we can perhaps, you know, be a bit more realistic about it. And actually, you don't need to invest the total sum and decarbonise completely. So I think those are kind of some of the key things that we can draw into the private sector as well.
Okay, Jonathan, you wanted to come in there?
Yeah, Lulu, I'm really interested in the construction sector. Is it renowned for kind of collaboration? That might be doing it a disservice, but in my years of working with it, it's not been its strength. And I wonder what's going to help it be at its best, and particularly the members, your members, not particularly the largest construction organisations, but the small to medium, who are the kind of bedrock of the country's construction sector. What's going to encourage them to be at their innovative and collaborative best? Because that's what we're going to need to deliver this. So, and where have you seen that, and how have you seen that work best, and what would that demand of us in the social housing sector or of government?
Sure. Well, so we're really interested in how we can kind of create that framework in the industry that supports a greater culture of upskilling and links between firms and things like that. And so we're also really interested in the fact that, and sorry, I'm referring to the Green Home Grants so much, but I think they're really relevant to this conversation. But the government set a requirement of each firm to achieve certain competency standards before they can get the funding to deliver these interventions. And I think that really kind of sets a premise for requiring certain levels of competency as part of public funding. And the FMB's been working on a campaign for a couple of years now about whether we could introduce like a mandatory licensing scheme for all companies in construction. So they actually have licensing schemes in other countries in the world, like in Germany and some states in Australia. And basically before you set up your business and start trading, you have to get a license first. That might require some business and technical checks. And you know, we feel strongly that in establishing something similar in the UK, you kind of create a barrier to entry, but in doing so, you improve quality and standards across the industry. And you also build confidence among consumers in the industry too, because they know that this is something they're going to be getting a quality service. So whilst that may be a slightly longer term view, we are talking in the context here of reaching 2050. And so I think we can afford to take a long term view in kind of competency and standards too.
I wanted to say thanks, Lulu. I'm conscious of time as well, so this is the first podcast we've done. So what I don't know is how patient audiences will be when they're listening in. But there's so we'll wrap up shortly. But I'm very keen to ask the VHS Betamax question, John, and I wondered if I could send that in your direction, which is this. You know, technology moves very quickly, doesn't it? And we're quite some way away from 2050. How do we know that we're going to be backing the right horse in terms of the kind of technology that we're going to be investing in to get to a zero carbon future?
Yeah, good question, James, and I'm sure probably there isn't a simple answer to that. I think the work that we've done with 25 social landlords so far has been very much around a fabric first approach, which is to insulate properties before we worry about what heating system we're going to be putting in them. And there's two reasons for that. One is to reduce the energy demand of that property, which will obviously impact upon the heating system that you're going to put in the future. But also it's that we don't really know how technology is going to develop wholly over the next 10, 15 plus years. There's improvements all the time in terms of both, you know, the type of product that are available and also the cost of those products. And I think that reducing the heat demand of a property or the energy demand of a property through insulation, we're adopting here tried and proven methods of insulation to a greater extent. Sure, we need to work out how we're going to insulate floors other than hacking up a floor. And there will be thinner insulation systems coming around, but what we put on external walls, we've got a good track record in that, and probably that's a safer bet. As far as technology goes, though, what type of heat pump or whether it should be a heat pump at all, we don't know the answer to that yet. And I think we have to make a decision based upon the right technical information that we have today and be prepared to innovate and change our mind as we move forward, because you know, there will be new systems come out in 10 years' time that will be far more efficient and cost effective than today. Doesn't mean we've made the wrong decision today. We've made the decision today based upon the right thing. And one of the things I think that the industry needs to do is to be open and honest with itself about the type of products that we have available. Let's learn from other countries, because we're not the first people in the world to have installed heat pumps, for instance. Let's learn about what others are doing and where we've made mistakes in the past. Let's not repeat those. So I think it's a slowly job, James. I think if we make the wrong decisions today, let's make sure we only have a small percentage of those that are the wrong decisions, and that we learn quickly and we share knowledge and collaborate. And that's what I think the housing sector is able to do. I think the contracting sector needs to do that as well, because as Jonathan said, it's not the best at disseminating knowledge and collaborating. And that way we might get the general public on side and then have a confidence, because, you know, as a private homeowner myself, would I know what product to go and put in my house and go and spend 20 or 30, 40,000 pounds on it? Most people wouldn't. So we have to have an education exercise here for people as well. So there's a lot of work to do, I think, first of all, before we jump in both feet first. But we have to keep our eyes and ears open, definitely.
John, thank you. I'm going to draw things to a close now. I get the feeling that between us we could probably carry on talking all day about this, but I'm not sure how interested people would be in hearing us talk for another 2 or 3 hours. But this has been an endlessly fascinating subject. I just want to thank all of you for coming on and sharing your huge amount of knowledge in this area. And then just to those people listening, just a reminder that it's still not too late to add your support to the Homes at the Heart campaign, and join us to make the case for placing investment in social housing at the heart of the UK's recovery. So thank you all very much for participating, and thank you all very much for listening. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.